Hello, my dear friends. It's nice to see you again. Listen, prepare yourself a cup of tea and a comfortable sofa. Today, I will bring you a meaningful story that I am sure you will love. Are you ready? Fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. Today's story is about a year after a painful divorce. Billionaire CEO Alexander Grant's ex-wife finds herself working as a server to make ends meet. One evening, her heart skips a beat when she looks up to see Alexander dining at one of her tables, with a stunning woman by his side. The exclusive ambience of Lumina, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants, was designed to captivate. Warm, ambient lighting highlighted the sleek, minimalist decor, while every detail, from the bespoke crystal glasses to the meticulously folded linen napkins, spoke of luxury. Sitting by the expansive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the dazzling city skyline, Alexander Grant reclined in his chair with an air of effortless dominance. Across from him sat Sofia Delgado, her black silk gown clinging to her elegant frame, enhancing her natural allure. She let out a melodic laugh, tossing her hair back to reveal diamond earrings that shimmered in the golden light. She was well aware of the admiring glances cast her way. "I'm telling you, Alex," Sophia said, her manicured fingers delicately tracing the rim of her wine glass. "If this merger goes through, we'll dominate the industry like no one else. You and me, a powerhouse team." Alexander allowed himself a faint, knowing smile. She wasn't wrong. Sophia was astute, fiercely ambitious, and had an almost uncanny ability to spot opportunities before anyone else. It wasn't just her beauty that had drawn him to her. It was her relentless drive, a quality that mirrored his own. Sophia wasn't merely a business partner. Tonight, she could become something far more personal. "Timing is everything," Alexander replied, his deep voice calm yet commanding. "And the right partnerships will ensure no one even comes close to what we can achieve." Sophia's eyes lit up, her smile broadening. Alexander could see she was enthralled, and he felt a surge of satisfaction. The evening was unfolding exactly as planned. From the exclusivity of the restaurant to the curated menu and the carefully chosen Margaux wine they shared, every detail had been meticulously arranged. Like the wine, rare, refined, and unattainable to most, Alexander knew how to command his surroundings. As he sipped the velvety wine, his gaze instinctively wandered across the room, a habit he had of observing people, assessing their ambitions and significance. Most faces blurred into insignificance: bankers, celebrities, socialites, people who either owed him favors or sought his attention. Then, his eyes landed on someone unexpected. At first, the woman in the crisp white shirt and black apron seemed out of place in the midst of such grandeur. Alexander assumed she was just another staff member, but there was something about her, her composed movements and quiet determination, that held his attention for a fleeting second. And then, she turned, and his world stopped. It was Elena Carter, his ex-wife. She didn't notice him at first, too absorbed in clearing an extravagant table. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat bun, with loose strands framing her face. Despite wearing no makeup, her striking features, the high cheekbones, the soft curve of her jaw, were just as he remembered. Yet now, there was something new in her expression. A weariness, a shadow that hadn't been there before. "Alex." Sophia's voice broke his trance. Blinking, he turned back to her, finding her watching him with a curious tilt of her head. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice light yet tinged with concern. "Of course," he replied smoothly, masking the storm inside. "Just reflecting on what you said." Satisfied, Sophia resumed her polished monologue about market strategies and projections. Alexander nodded along, his responses automatic, while his mind kept returning to Elena. Elena moved briskly, avoiding the gaze of diners, her focus solely on her tasks. When their eyes finally met, it was just for a second, but Alexander felt the impact like a physical blow. Recognition flickered in her eyes before she quickly looked away, her pace quickening as though she were fleeing his gaze. His thoughts churned. The last time they had seen each other was in court, their marriage dissolving in a flurry of bitter accusations. She had been proud, defiant, determined to rebuild her life. Yet now, here she was, reduced to clearing tables in a restaurant where he dined with clients and companions. How had it come to this? A pang of guilt surfaced, unbidden. Their divorce had been turbulent, but he had convinced himself it was what she wanted. She had walked away from the life they had built together, from the wealth and prestige he had fought so hard to achieve. But now, seeing her like this, Alexander couldn't help but wonder if he had misjudged everything. Had he underestimated the toll it would take on her? Had he been too blind, too wrapped up in his own ambitions, to see what she had sacrificed? Alex. Sophia's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, sharper this time, her irritation evident. "Sorry," he murmured, quickly setting down his glass. "Just a lot on my mind." Sophia leaned in, her voice softening to a teasing murmur. "Let me help you forget about it," she said, her hand brushing his lightly across the table. Alexander managed a faint smile, but his attention remained elsewhere. Across the room, Elena had slipped into the kitchen with a tray of empty dishes. He couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his chest or the questions clawing at the edges of his mind. What had happened to her since their divorce? Why was she here, of all places? And why, after all these years, did it still matter to him? The flawless evening he had so carefully orchestrated was starting to unravel. The pristine image of his life, polished to perfection, was now cracking at the edges. For the first time in years, Alexander Grant felt uncertain. His fingers hovered over the stem of his wine glass, but he didn't lift it. His grip was too tense, his thoughts too scattered. Across from him, Sophia tilted her head slightly, her brows knitting together in subtle frustration. She was saying something about market strategy, something critical, no doubt, but her words barely registered. His mind was a tangled mess of disbelief and unease. Elena? Here? It didn't make sense. The Elena he knew had been ambitious, fierce, and unshakably resilient. She had walked out of their marriage with her head held high, determined to forge a new life for herself. Yet now, here she was, waiting tables in a restaurant catering to the very elite she once stood among. It was jarring, almost unreal. "Alex," Sophia said sharply, her voice slicing through his thoughts. "Are you even listening?" He blinked and met her gaze, forcing a smile that felt hollow. "Sorry, I got distracted for a moment. What were you saying?" Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't push immediately. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes narrowing as though she were trying to read his mood. "I was saying," she repeated, her tone careful, "that we need to solidify the board's confidence before the merger announcement. Timing is everything." Alexander nodded, his response automatic. "Absolutely. Confidence is key." She studied him for a moment, her irritation giving way to curiosity. "You're distracted," she said plainly. "Is everything all right?" For a brief second, he considered telling her the truth. But the idea of explaining why his ex-wife was here, in this setting, felt impossible. Sophia was many things, brilliant, ambitious, and undeniably beautiful. But empathy wasn't one of her strengths. She would see Elena's presence as nothing more than a crack in his otherwise polished armor. "Just a long week," he said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "It's nothing. Let's focus on tonight." Sophia's smile returned, faint but calculating. She didn't press further, which he appreciated. The last thing he needed was to draw attention to Sophia. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept drifting back to the kitchen doors. The look in Elena's eyes when she saw him, recognition, followed by something else, lingered in his mind. Was it embarrassment? Resentment? He couldn't tell, but the memory gnawed at him. It was such a stark contrast to the Elena he remembered. Vibrant, self-assured, unafraid to meet anyone's gaze, even his. Just then, a movement caught his attention, pulling him back. There she was again. Elena emerged from the kitchen, balancing a tray of plates with the same quiet grace she'd always carried. Her steps were brisk yet steady, her posture straight despite the fatigue visible in her expression. She avoided looking in his direction, her focus locked on her task. Alexander couldn't tear his eyes away. Memories surged unbidden. Her laughter on lazy Sunday mornings, the way she scrunched her nose in concentration while sketching, the peaceful silences they used to share before their world began to crumble. He also remembered the arguments, the heated words exchanged in the dead of night, her accusations of him prioritizing his career above their marriage. She'd been right, of course. He had been consumed by his ambitions, blind to the toll it was taking on their relationship. By the time he'd realized the damage, it had been too late. Elena moved to a table nearby, deftly clearing glasses. Her eyes flicked up briefly, locking with his. This time, her expression was composed, almost detached, yet there was something beneath the surface, a flicker of recognition, an unspoken conversation they both seemed desperate to avoid. "Alex," Sophia said, her voice sharper now, pulling him back to the present. He turned to face her, startled by the frustration in her tone. Sophia had crossed her arms, her perfectly arched brows raised in growing impatience. "You've been distracted all night," she said. "You're looking at someone. Who is it?" Alexander hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. Lying would have been easy, but Sophia wasn't the type to drop a subject. If he brushed her off now, she'd only dig deeper later. "It's no one," he said finally, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. "Just someone I thought I recognized." Sophia's eyes narrowed as she glanced toward Elena. "The woman clearing tables?" she asked, tilting her head in that direction. "Is that who you're looking at?" Alexander's pulse quickened. "It doesn't matter," he said carefully. "Can we drop it?" But Sophia wasn't one to let things go. "Why are you so tense?" she pressed, her tone more curious than accusatory. "Do you know her?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yes," he admitted reluctantly. "She's someone I used to know." Sophia studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, her lips curved into a sly smile. "An ex," she guessed. Alexander didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Sophia's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said lightly, though her voice carried a sharp edge, "everyone has a past." He didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was too consumed by the fleeting moments of his encounter with Elena and the tension that lingered between them. He hadn't expected to see her again, especially not like this. Elena disappeared into the kitchen once more, and her absence brought a heavy silence to their table. Sophia watched him closely, her sharp gaze probing for cracks in his composure. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked eventually, her tone softer now, almost inquisitive. Alexander shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "There's nothing to talk about." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Elena's presence had stirred something in him, something he wasn't ready to confront. As the evening wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was no mere coincidence. That night, Alexander didn't sleep. The image of Elena, head down, arms full of plates, moving with quiet determination through the restaurant, lingered in his mind. It followed him home to his cavernous penthouse, settling in the silence of his bedroom. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts an unrelenting tide. Elena had been the one person who had truly understood him, the only one who had seen past his polished exterior to the man beneath. She had challenged him, pushed him to be better, and for a time, he thought he had been. But now, seeing her in that uniform, working a job so far removed from the life she once knew, he couldn't help but wonder, had he been the one to push her here? The next morning, as Alexander sat in his home office sipping coffee that had gone cold, memories of her came flooding back. Elena had always been a force of nature, unstoppable, fearless. Seeing her like this felt like a reckoning. Elena had been a force of nature when they met, an artist with an unapologetic boldness and a sharp wit that had captivated Alexander from their first conversation. She hadn't cared about his wealth or status, often teasing him about the soulless corporate world he dominated. But she had loved him, not the billionaire CEO, but the man beneath the title. For a time, their differences had felt like complementary strengths. Elena kept him grounded, reminding him that there was more to life than profit margins and strategic takeovers. Alexander admired her courage to pursue her art, even when it wasn't lucrative. But as his empire grew, so did the demands on his time. Late nights at the office turned into missed dinners, broken promises, and an ever-growing distance between them. Elena tried to be patient, but resentment slowly brewed, fueled by Alexander's increasing detachment. Their last major argument was etched in his memory as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. She had stood in their living room, her arms crossed, her face flushed with frustration. "All you care about is winning," she had said, her voice trembling. "Your company, your image, your legacy. What about us, Alex? What about me?" He had told her she didn't understand, that building something meaningful required sacrifices. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. The truth was he had stopped trying. He had assumed she would always be there, waiting for him, no matter how many times he put her second. When she finally filed for divorce, he hadn't fought it. Instead, he buried himself in work, using his empire as a shield against the pain of losing her. His legal team had ensured that his assets were protected. Elena had walked away with a fraction of what she was entitled to, and at the time, he hadn't given it a second thought. But now, in the cold light of morning, the weight of that decision pressed heavily on him. Alexander leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. A stack of contracts awaited his signature, but he couldn't focus. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. He had always justified his actions by telling himself that Elena was strong and resourceful, that she didn't need his money. But had he been wrong? The uniform she wore at the restaurant, the exhaustion etched into her face. It didn't align with the vibrant, independent woman he had loved. Life had worn her down in ways he hadn't foreseen. Unable to shake his unease, Alexander picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. After a moment's hesitation, he dialed the number of a mutual friend who had kept in touch with Elena after the divorce. "Alex?" The voice on the other end sounded surprised. "This is unexpected. What can I do for you?" "I need to know about Elena," Alexander said, his tone direct. "How has she been? What's going on in her life?" There was a long pause. "Why do you care now?" the friend asked, their voice cautious. "You made it pretty clear back then that you were moving on." "I know," Alexander admitted quietly, "but I saw her last night. She was working at Lumina." The friend sighed, their reluctance palpable. "She's had a tough year," they finally said. After the divorce, she tried to keep her studio open, but without the financial support she used to have, it got hard. Then her landlord raised the rent, and she couldn't keep up. She had to shut it down. Alexander felt his stomach sink. Elena's art studio had been her sanctuary, her dream. Losing it must have been devastating. She took on freelance work, the friend continued, but it wasn't enough to cover everything. She ended up selling her house and moving into a smaller apartment. The restaurant job, it's to make ends meet. Alexander sat in silence, the guilt settling deeper into his chest. He had known Elena was proud, that she would never ask for help, but he hadn't realized how much she had lost. She doesn't talk about it much, the friend added, but I know it's been rough. She's been through a lot, Alex. After the call ended, Alexander sat in his office, his thoughts racing. The image of Elena at the restaurant, her head held high despite everything, stuck with him. She didn't belong in that world, not because she was above the work, but because her passion had always been her art, and he had taken that from her. The realization hit him like a blow. His aggressive legal team, his refusal to give her more than the bare minimum, his selfish need to protect his empire, it had all contributed to her downfall. He had justified it at the time, telling himself that she had chosen to leave, that she didn't deserve a piece of what he had built. But now, that reasoning felt hollow, cruel, even. For the first time in years, Alexander wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Alexander realized he might have been wrong about everything. Elena had always been his equal, his partner. She had stood by him when no one else would, and he had let her down. The guilt weighed on him, almost unbearable, but underneath it was something else, a spark of determination. He didn't know how to fix things or if Elena would even let him try, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't ignore it anymore. The next evening, Alexander found himself back at Lumina. He told himself it was to tie up loose ends from the night before, but the truth gnawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about Elena, her quiet resilience, her weary grace. Part of him hoped to talk to her, to find some way to make amends, though he wasn't sure where to begin. When Sophia suggested they return for a follow-up dinner to discuss the merger, Alexander hesitated. Declining would have raised questions, and the thought of seeing Elena again tugged at him like a thread he couldn't leave loose. The restaurant was as lively as ever, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. This time, their table was closer to the kitchen. Alexander scanned the room discreetly, searching for Elena, but she was nowhere to be seen. Sophia, oblivious to his distraction, launched into a discussion about an upcoming board meeting. Alexander nodded, offering the occasional comment, though his thoughts were elsewhere. When Elena finally appeared, balancing a tray of wine glasses, his chest tightened. She looked just as tired as the night before, her movements precise but lacking energy. Her uniform was spotless, her hair neatly tied back, but there was a quiet resignation in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. Alexander couldn't help but watch her as she moved between tables, her gaze fixed firmly on her tasks. When she reached the table next to theirs and began clearing plates, her back turned to them. Sophia's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You know," Sophia said, leaning forward, "it's always fascinating how some people never rise above their circumstances. They just stay where they are, doing the bare minimum to get by." Alexander's stomach tightened. He glanced at Elena, who froze for the briefest moment before continuing her work. The tension in her shoulders was subtle but unmistakable. "I mean," Sophia continued, oblivious to the effect of her words, "look at the staff here. Polite, sure, but you can tell they're just coasting. No ambition, no drive. It's why they'll always be stuck in jobs like this." Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but Elena turned around, her posture straight and composed. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet defiance. "Excuse me," Elena said, her voice steady and polite, though there was an unmistakable edge to her tone. "But I think you're mistaken. Ambition isn't measured by job titles or bank accounts. Sometimes it takes more strength to survive than it does to succeed. Sophia blinked, clearly caught off guard. I didn't mean, she began, but Elena wasn't done. I work here because I have responsibilities, Elena continued, her tone sharp yet controlled. Because I'm rebuilding my life after circumstances that were out of my control. That doesn't make me less ambitious or less worthy of respect. Nearby tables had gone silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Sophia flushed, clearly unused to being challenged so directly. Alexander's pulse quickened. Elena's words were a testament to her resilience and strength, a stark reminder of the woman he had once loved. He couldn't let the situation escalate further. That's enough, Alexander said, his voice firm but gentle. He stood, stepping between the two women. Sophia, I think we need to move on from this conversation. Sophia's eyes darted to him, a mix of confusion and irritation in her expression. Alex, I didn't mean anything by it, she said defensively. I know, Alexander replied evenly, but this isn't the time or place. Elena's gaze met his, steady and unreadable. For a moment, Alexander thought she might say more, but then she turned back to her work, leaving the tension behind as she carried on with quiet dignity. Sophia watched her retreat, then turned to Alexander with furrowed brows. What just happened? She asked, her voice low. Why are you so involved? Alexander hesitated, the weight of her question heavy in the air. This wasn't how he wanted things to unfold, but the tension was impossible to ignore. She's someone I used to know, he admitted finally, his voice quiet. Sophia tilted her head, her frown deepening. An ex? She guessed, her tone sharper now. Yes, Alexander said, deciding there was no point in denying it. Her name is Elena. For a moment, Sophia said nothing, her gaze fixed on him as if trying to piece together a puzzle. And she works here? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. She does, Alexander replied simply, unwilling to elaborate further. Sophia leaned back in her chair, her lips pressing into a thin line. You knew this, didn't you? That's why you've been so distracted. Alexander didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know how to explain the whirlwind of emotions swirling within him. Guilt, regret, admiration, all tangled into a chaotic knot he couldn't unravel. Sophia sighed, shaking her head. Well, that explains a lot, she said coolly. I'll be honest, Alex, I'm not sure what to make of this. Alexander nodded, acknowledging her unease. It's complicated, he said, his voice steady. That much is clear, Sophia replied, her expression unreadable. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence. The easy rapport they had shared before was now fractured. Sophia remained polite but distant, her focus more on her wine glass than on Alexander. As for Alexander, his thoughts stayed firmly on Elena. Her words replayed in his mind, a stark reminder of the resilience and strength that had once captivated him. He couldn't ignore the way she had stood her ground, even in the face of someone like Sophia. When the dinner finally ended, Alexander escorted Sophia to her car, offering a quiet apology for the awkwardness of the evening. She accepted it with a curt nod, though the tension between them lingered. As he watched her car disappear into the night, Alexander found himself lingering outside the restaurant, his gaze drifting toward the entrance. Elena was still inside, no doubt finishing her shift. He didn't know what he would say to her if their paths crossed again, but one thing was certain. He couldn't keep ignoring the impact he had on her life, or the part of himself that still cared. The cool night air brushed against his skin as Alexander stood by his car. Sophia was gone, and the evening with her had unraveled in ways he hadn't anticipated. He should have left too, retreating to the comfort of his penthouse and the solitude it offered. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to go. His mind was still filled with Elena, her defiance, her exhaustion, and the weight of all she had endured. When the restaurant doors finally opened and Elena stepped out, Alexander's breath caught. She didn't notice him at first, her head down, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Her steps were brisk and purposeful, but the weariness in her posture tugged at something deep inside him. He didn't think twice. "Elena," he called out, his voice firm but low enough not to draw attention. She stopped mid-step, her shoulders tensing. For a moment, she seemed to debate whether to keep walking, but then she turned. Her expression was a mixture of annoyance and exhaustion. "What do you want, Alex?" she asked, her tone sharp. Alexander approached cautiously, his hands in his pockets, trying to appear less imposing. "We need to talk," he said. She laughed bitterly, a sound that cut through the quiet night. "We don't need to do anything." Her voice hardened. "Whatever you think you're doing, stop. You've done enough." Her words stung, but Alexander held his ground. "I'm not here to fight," he said, keeping his tone calm. I need to understand. Why are you working here? What happened?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "What happened?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You happened, Alex. Your lawyers, your settlement, your indifference. That's what happened." He flinched, guilt twisting in his chest. "I didn't know things were this bad," he said quietly. "Of course you didn't," Elena snapped, crossing her arms. Her gaze was unwavering. "You don't see anything outside your perfect little bubble. You have no idea what it's like to struggle," Elena said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "To start over from nothing." "I didn't think," Alexander began, but he stopped himself, realizing too late how dismissive his words would sound. "You didn't think I'd end up here?" Elena finished for him, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Of course not. Because you didn't think about me at all. Not during the divorce, not after. You just moved on and left me to pick up the pieces." Alexander swallowed hard, the weight of her accusation pressing down on him. She was right. He had been so consumed with protecting his empire, his image, that he had never considered the fallout for her. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said quietly. "I thought you'd be fine." "You thought," she interrupted, her voice cutting through his. "That's the problem, Alex. You assumed, but you never asked." He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, realizing he had no defense. She was right. He hadn't asked, hadn't cared enough to see beyond his own priorities. Elena sighed, the anger in her expression softening slightly, replaced by a weariness that pierced deeper than her words. "I don't need your pity," she said, her tone quieter now. "I don't need you swooping in to fix things because you suddenly feel guilty." "I'm not here to pity you," Alexander said quickly, taking a step closer. "I'm here because I care." She laughed, a softer sound this time, but no less bitter. "Care? Since when? You didn't care when I begged you to prioritize us. You didn't care when your legal team made sure I walked away with next to nothing. So why now?" "Because I was wrong," he admitted, the words feeling both foreign and necessary. "I made mistakes, Elena. I see that now. I can't change the past, but I want to help." Her gaze hardened again, her eyes narrowing. "Help? How? By throwing money at me? Buying me a better job? You still don't get it, do you? I don't want your charity. I don't want anything from you." Her words hit him like a blow, but he didn't back down. "This isn't about charity," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "It's about doing what I should have done a year ago." "And what's that?" she challenged. "Make yourself feel better? Ease your conscience?" Alexander shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why are you so determined to push me away?" "Because I've had to rebuild my life from the ground up," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Every step I've taken, every decision I've made, has been mine. I've fought for my dignity, Alex. I'm not going to let you take that away from me now. He didn't know how to respond. For a man who thrived on control, who always had the perfect words to sway a boardroom or close a deal, he felt utterly lost in front of her. Elena exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I don't need your help, she said, her tone softer but resolute. I'm okay. I'm not where I want to be yet, but I'll get there on my own. Alexander wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't have to do it alone, but the resolve in her eyes stopped him. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, the fierce, independent force of nature who refused to let anyone define her. Okay, he said finally, his voice quiet, but if you ever change your mind, if you ever need anything, I won't, she said firmly, cutting him off. He nodded, though it hurt more than he expected. All right, but for what it's worth, I am sorry, Elena. For everything. She didn't respond immediately, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, she turned and walked away, her steps purposeful and steady. Alexander watched her go, the weight of their conversation settling heavily over him. He had come seeking answers, hoping to ease his guilt. Instead, he had been forced to confront just how deeply he had failed her. For the first time in years, Alexander Grant felt powerless, and as Elena disappeared into the night, he realized that the road to redemption, if it even existed, would be one he had to walk alone. Back in his penthouse, the glittering city skyline stretched out before him like a distant, untouchable dream. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of traffic far below. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the table beside him, the amber liquid catching the light. Alexander leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as Elena's words echoed in his mind. She didn't need him. She didn't want his help. And while part of him respected her for that, another part ached at how far they had drifted from the people they used to be. Memories surfaced unbidden, drawing Alexander back to a time when everything had been different, when Elena had been his whole world. They had met at a charity gala, one of those extravagant affairs filled with champagne flutes and shallow small talk. Alexander had been bored, scanning the room for familiar faces, when he saw her. She stood by the buffet table, holding a plate of hors d'oeuvres she didn't seem interested in eating. Her dress was simple, understated amidst the extravagance, yet she carried herself with a confidence that made her stand out. Intrigued by her unaffected demeanor, Alexander approached her. Their conversation had flowed effortlessly, weaving through topics both deep and trivial. Elena was unlike anyone he had ever met, sharp-witted, passionate, and unafraid to challenge him. She didn't care about his wealth or his reputation. She cared about the person beneath the polished facade. Those early days had been a whirlwind of discovery. They spent long nights talking about everything and nothing, exploring the city together and dreaming of a future where their worlds could merge. Elena was a painter then, her small studio tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. One night, she showed him her work, her hands stained with paint as she explained the meaning behind each piece. "This one's about possibility," she said, gesturing to a vibrant canvas of swirling colors. "Even when things feel stagnant, there's always something waiting to break through." Alexander had loved that about her, the way she saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. She had made him feel grounded, alive in a way his corporate world never could. For a time, he believed they could balance each other out. But as the years passed, cracks began to form. Alexander's company grew rapidly, demanding more of his time and energy. He thrived on the pressure, the thrill of closing deals and outmaneuvering competitors, but his success came at a steep cost. Late nights at the office turned into missed dinners, vacations were postponed and then canceled altogether, and his phone was a constant presence, pulling him away even when he was home. Elena tried to be patient. She understood his ambition, admired it even, but she also saw how it consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. One evening, she confronted him, her voice trembling with frustration. "Alex, you're not here," she said. "Even when you're home, you're somewhere else. I feel like I'm competing with your work, and I'm losing." He had brushed her concerns aside, assuring her it was only temporary, that things would settle down once the company hit its next milestone. But things never settled. There was always another deal, another project, another goal just out of reach. The arguments became more frequent. Their once effortless connection strained under the weight of unmet expectations. Elena had wanted a simpler life, one where they could focus on each other and the things that truly mattered. But Alexander, consumed by his drive for success, couldn't see what he was losing. The breaking point came on their 5th anniversary. Elena had planned a quiet evening at home, complete with a homemade dinner and a gift she had spent weeks preparing. Alexander, caught up in a last-minute meeting, had forgotten. He arrived home late to find her waiting, the candles on the table burned down to stubs. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I've tried, Alex. I've tried to make this work, but I can't be the only one fighting for us." He stood there, speechless, as she packed a bag and walked out the door. The divorce that followed was swift and clinical, handled by lawyers with little involvement from either of them. Alexander buried himself in work, using it as a shield against the pain of losing her. Now, sitting alone in the dim light of his penthouse, those memories pressed down on him like a weight he could no longer ignore. He had told himself that his sacrifices were necessary, that the life he was building justified the time he had taken away from her. But at what cost? Seeing Elena now, working at a restaurant just to make ends meet, he realized how blind he had been. For all his achievements, Alexander felt a profound emptiness. The penthouse, the cars, the accolades. None of it mattered in the quiet moments when he was left alone with his thoughts. He had built an empire, but in doing so, he had alienated the one person who had truly seen him. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the sprawling city below. The lights stretched endlessly, a testament to his ambition, but for the first time, they felt hollow, a reminder of everything he had sacrificed in his pursuit of more. Alexander thought of Elena's words, her refusal to accept his help, her determination to rebuild her life on her own terms. It was a strength he had always admired, even if it left him feeling powerless to atone for his mistakes. He exhaled deeply, his breath fogging the cold glass in front of him. He didn't know if he could ever truly make things right with Elena, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep living the way he had been. Success had come at too high a price, and it was time to reevaluate what truly mattered. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the stirrings of something he couldn't quite define. Not a hunger for power or prestige, but a longing for meaning. And though he didn't know where this new path would lead, he knew he had to start somewhere. Alexander awoke the next morning to the relentless buzzing of his phone. Groaning, he rolled over to grab it from the nightstand. His notifications were flooded, texts, emails, and missed calls clamoring for his attention. A message from his assistant, Hannah, marked urgent, stood out. "Alex, you need to see this." The link led to a gossip blog. The headline screamed in bold, "Billionaire Alexander Grant's dinner drama, spotted with ex-wife turned waitress." Beneath it was a grainy photo of Alexander standing close to Elena, his face tense, her expression equally fierce. In the background, Sophia was visible, her glare cutting through the scene. The article speculated wildly about Alexander's relationships with both women, weaving a lurid tale of a love triangle. He cursed under his breath as he scrolled further. The piece didn't stop at baseless speculation. It delved into Elena's recent struggles with unsettling accuracy. Her failed art studio, her financial hardships, her current job at the restaurant. The tone was patronizing, framing her as the fallen ex-wife of a man who seemingly had everything. He tossed the phone onto the bed and ran a hand through his hair. The article wasn't just invasive, it was cruel. Elena had always valued her privacy, and now her life was being dissected for public consumption. Worse, it painted him as the villain, the detached billionaire who had abandoned her to fend for herself. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Hannah, looking unusually tense. "They're all over this," she said, stepping into the room. "Every major outlet is picking it up. Stockholders are asking questions. And Sophia, well, you should probably talk to her." Alexander sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Where is she?" "She called a meeting," Hannah replied. "She's waiting downstairs." Dressed quickly, his mind racing, Alexander made his way to the living room. Sophia stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, arms crossed, her expression colder than he'd ever seen. A tablet rested on the coffee table, displaying the same article he had just read. "Explain," she said sharply as he entered. Her tone clipped. "It's not what it looks like," Alexander began, though the words felt hollow even to him. "The article exaggerates everything. Elena and I—" "Elena and you what?" Sophia interrupted, her voice rising. "You're spotted with your ex-wife, who the world now knows is working as a waitress, and you didn't think to mention any of this to me? Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" Alexander frowned. "This isn't about you, Sophia." Her eyes narrowed. "Of course it's about me. I'm your partner, professionally and, until now, personally. This kind of scandal reflects on both of us." "She didn't ask for this," Alexander said firmly. "Elena has nothing to do with you or the merger. She's just trying to live her life. And yet her name is in every headline alongside yours," Sophia snapped. "You're being painted as the heartless ex who abandoned her, and I'm the opportunistic girlfriend. Do you think that's good for business? For my reputation?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. "I can't control what the press writes, and I'm not going to cut ties with Elena just because they're twisting the truth." Sophia's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Cut ties? Alex, you shouldn't have any ties with her. She's your ex-wife. Whatever guilt you feel, it's not your responsibility to fix her life." He took a step closer, his tone low but steady. "You don't know anything about her." "Elena is the strongest person I've ever known," Alexander said, his voice calm but firm. "She doesn't need me to fix her life. She's already doing that on her own. What she doesn't need is people like you looking down on her." Sophia's jaw tightened, her expression growing colder. "This isn't about her, Alex. This is about you and me. I've worked too hard to let some tabloid scandal derail everything I've built. If you're serious about us, you'll cut ties with Elena and make a public statement clarifying your position." Alexander stared at her, the weight of her ultimatum sinking in. For years, he had thrived in a world of negotiations and compromises, weighing risks against rewards. But this wasn't a deal he was willing to make. "She's not part of our lives," Sophia continued, her tone softening slightly. "Let her go. Focus on us." Alexander exhaled, his gaze drifting to the city skyline behind her. For all her beauty and ambition, Sophia didn't understand. She couldn't see the humanity in the situation, how Elena had been thrust into the spotlight against her will, or the man Alexander was trying to become. Not the one who ignored the consequences of his actions, but the one who faced them. "No," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'm not going to abandon Elena just to make things easier for us. She's been through enough because of me. If you can't handle that, maybe this isn't going to work." Sophia's eyes widened, shock flickering across her face. "You're choosing her over me?" It's not about choosing, Alexander said resolutely. It's about doing what's right. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension in the room thick with unspoken words. Finally, Sophia picked up her bag, her expression cold and unreadable. "Good luck with that," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. Without another word, she walked out, leaving Alexander alone with the quiet hum of the city. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door she had closed behind her. The path he had chosen wasn't the easiest, but for the first time in years, it felt like the right one. Turning back to the window, Alexander resolved to face the fallout head-on. If the world wanted a story, they would get one. But it would be one of accountability, of acknowledging his mistakes, and of finding a way to make things right. Elena deserved that much. So did he. The days that followed were a whirlwind of chaos. Alexander's office was flooded with calls from PR consultants, board members, and media outlets, all clamoring for a response to the scandal. Sophia's departure from his life barely registered amid the noise, her cold goodbye echoing faintly in the back of his mind. For all the urgency swirling around him, Alexander's focus remained fixed on one thing: Elena. The thought of her life being exposed to the public, her struggles paraded as entertainment, made his stomach churn. He had contributed to this, indirectly or not, and the guilt was a constant companion, urging him to act. But this time, it wasn't about easing his conscience. It was about doing what he should have done a year ago, acknowledging her pain, owning his part in it, and giving her the respect she deserved. He called the restaurant where Elena worked, learning her schedule from a reluctant manager. It felt invasive, but he didn't want to ambush her during a shift. If they were going to talk, it had to be on her terms. The following evening, Alexander arrived at a small park near her apartment. The information had been too easy to find, a sobering reminder of how little privacy Elena now had. He waited by a bench near the fountain, rehearsing the words he needed to say, unsure how she would receive them. When Elena appeared, walking home after her shift, she didn't notice him at first. Her bag was slung over her shoulder, her steps purposeful but unhurried. As she drew closer, her gaze met his, and she froze in her tracks. "What are you doing here, Alex?" she asked, her voice wary. "I need to talk to you," he said, standing. "Please," she sighed, glancing around the park. The paths were quiet, save for a few joggers in the distance. After a long pause, she stepped closer, crossing her arms. "Fine," she said. "Talk." Alexander hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for everything. For the way the divorce went, for how I handled it all. I was selfish," Alexander admitted, his voice low. "I didn't think about what it would mean for you." Elena's expression didn't soften. "You're right," she said, her tone sharp. "You didn't." He nodded, accepting her rebuke. "I saw what happened with the press, how they dragged your life into the spotlight. I know I can't undo that, but I want to help. Not with money," he added quickly, noticing the flicker of anger in her eyes, "but with whatever you need. Support, connections, anything." Elena shook her head, a bitter smile curling her lips. "Alex, you still don't get it, do you? I don't need you to swoop in and save me. I've been through hell this past year, but I've made it through on my own, and I'm proud of that." "I know you are," Alexander said softly, "and I respect that more than you know. This isn't about me trying to fix things for you. It's about trying to show you that I understand now, even if it's too late." Her eyes softened slightly, though her posture remained guarded. "Why now?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Why are you here after all this time?" "Because seeing you again reminded me of what I lost," Alexander admitted. "Not just you, but the person I was when I was with you. I've spent so much of my life chasing success that I forgot what it meant to be human. You were my anchor, Elena, and I let you go." Elena's gaze didn't waver, but the silence between them grew heavy with unspoken emotion. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but resolute. "Alex, I'm not the same person I was when we were married, and neither are you. Whatever you're looking for, closure, redemption, I can't give it to you." "I'm not asking you to," he said quickly. "I just want you to know that I see you. I see how strong you are, how much you've overcome, and I want you to know that if you ever need anything, anything at all, I'm here." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally, her voice calm, "and I hope you mean it. But I don't need a second chance with you, Alex. I need to keep moving forward on my own." Alexander felt a pang of regret but nodded, understanding. "I get it," he said softly, "and I hope you know that I'll always root for you, wherever life takes you." For the first time that evening, Elena smiled, a faint but genuine expression. "Thank you," she said, "but I've got this." Without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps confident and unhurried. Alexander watched her go, his heart heavy but lighter at the same time. She didn't need him, she never had. And while that truth stung, it was also freeing. Elena would be okay. She would thrive. As he turned back toward the fountain, Alexander felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. His life had been built on ambition and the relentless pursuit of the next big thing, but ambition had cost him more than he had realized. It was time to stop running, to face himself honestly, and to find meaning beyond the boardroom. For Elena, the path forward was clear. For Alexander, it was just beginning. But for the first time, he welcomed the uncertainty because now he understood what truly mattered. Not the success he had always chased, but the connections he had too often ignored. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to rebuild, not with Elena, but with himself. The next day, Alexander made one final effort to bring closure, not to her life, but to his own. He called his assistant and asked her to cancel all his meetings. For once, the empire could wait. He needed time to think, to act, and to finally confront the guilt he had carried for so long. His first stop was his company. Meeting with the board, Alexander laid out plans that had been simmering in the back of his mind for weeks. He proposed stepping back from day-to-day operations, transferring more power to his executive team. It was time to let go, not just for Elena's sake, but for his own. His life had been consumed by ambition, and now he was ready to rediscover what he had lost in the process. The board, though shocked, respected his decision. Even the most driven leaders, they understood, needed to find balance. Men, even the most driven, needed space to breathe. Alexander left the board meeting with a surprising sense of relief, knowing he had taken the first step toward something new. Next, he made a quiet gesture, one he hoped might bring Elena some peace. Through an anonymous donation, he contributed to a grant for emerging artists, ensuring that others like her would have opportunities she had once struggled to find. It wasn't about redemption. It was about honoring the woman she had been and the resilience she had shown. Weeks passed, and Alexander found himself settling into a different rhythm. His days were quieter, filled with moments of reflection and small joys he had previously overlooked. He visited art galleries, attended community events, and even reconnected with old friends he had long neglected. Slowly, the weight of his past began to lift. One evening, while walking through the city, Alexander passed by a gallery hosting a new exhibit. Drawn by curiosity, he stepped inside. The space was alive with energy, the walls adorned with vibrant and evocative paintings. At the center of it all was a familiar name, Elena Carter. Elena stood speaking to a small group, her hands moving animatedly as she explained the inspiration behind one of her pieces. She looked radiant, confident and completely at ease in her element. Alexander stayed at a distance, not wanting to intrude, but his heart swelled with pride. As the crowd around her thinned, Elena's eyes met his across the room. She paused, her expression unreadable, before excusing herself from the conversation. She approached him with measured steps, her head held high. "Alex," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "What are you doing here?" "I saw your name," he admitted. "I wanted to see your work." Elena nodded, her gaze softening slightly. "And it's incredible," he said sincerely. "You've always been incredible." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history lingering between them. Finally, Alexander broke the quiet. "I just wanted to say one last thing," he said. "I'm proud of you, Elena, not just for what you've accomplished, but for the person you are. I know I didn't always see that when we were together, but I see it now." Elena studied him, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "And I hope you found what you're looking for, too." "I'm getting there," Alexander replied with a faint smile. "It's a work in progress." Her smile widened, and for the first time in years, there was no tension between them, just understanding. "Take care of yourself, Alex," she said, her voice warm but final. "You too," he replied. Elena turned and walked back into the gallery, her presence commanding yet light. Alexander watched her go, a sense of closure settling over him. She was thriving, and that was enough. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Alexander felt a strange calm wash over him. For years, he had been driven by ambition, guilt, and the need to control. But now, for the first time, he felt free. Not because he had fixed everything, but because he had finally learned to let go. With that, Alexander Grant walked into the night, ready to embrace the uncertain yet hopeful path ahead. Alexander's story is a poignant reminder that success isn't measured by wealth or titles, but by the relationships we nurture and the impact we leave on others. Elena's journey reveals the resilience of the human spirit and the strength it takes to rebuild on our own terms. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments, what does redemption mean to you? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next stories.